Okay, so this week we're going to be learning a Gemara that deals with a passage in the Gemara doesn't quote it directly, but it's obviously trying to answer a question that is raised based on a passage in Sefer Yoshua. So we'll look at what it says in Yoshua, and then we'll learn our Gemara to see how it tries to deal with the issue that's raised by Sefer Yoshua. We'll look at a bunch of things that Tosfot says in relation to our sugya, and then a bunch of the other commentaries in terms of how they understand a specific aspect of what our Gemara is coming to say, and then we'll see contradictions between our Gemara and perhaps other midrashim elsewhere in the Talmud, and then in other midrashim as well, regarding what's known as the north wind. Right? That there's 4 winds, a wind for every direction. So the north wind plays a role in the Gemara that we're going to learn, and then we'll see that there's other midrashim that have other takes on perhaps the relationships between the different winds, and we'll maybe at the end try to kind of glean a message from that. So it's kind of jumping all over the place, but it all starts with this passage at the beginning of Sefer Yoshua, relatively at the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. So in Parak Hey, this is already after Bnei Yisrael have crossed over the Yarden and they're in Eretz Yisrael. And we're told as follows: Beitahi Amar Hashem Yoshua, Aseh lecha charvot surim v'shuv moled Bnei Yisrael shenit. So make yourselves flints or knives, and then circumcise Bnei Yisrael a second time. V'yas lo Yoshua charvot surim v'yamal et Bnei Yisrael givat aralot. So Yoshua does this, and he circumcises Bnei Yisrael. And then we're told V'zeh davar shamal Yoshua, and this is why he did it. As we all are very familiar with, the generation in the desert died out over the course of their wanderings due to the sin of the Chet HaMeraglim. So all the males who had left Egypt had all perished, save Yoshua and Kalev, before getting to Eretz Yisrael. Kimulim hayu kol ha'am hayotzim. And those people were all circumcised. Now, anyone who left Egypt had been circumcised already when they left Egypt. But anyone who was born in the desert during the 40 years was not circumcised. They wandered for 40 years until everybody passed away, because because they rebelled against God. And their children were born in their stead. Those children are the ones that Yoshua circumcised. They were arelim, uncircumcised. They had not been circumcised along the way. And so after Yoshua finished circumcising the whole nation, so they stayed there in the camp ad chayotam until they recovered, right? Because it takes time to recover from that. Now this is quite surprising, right? If it wasn't in Sefer Yoshua, you would think a person would assume that Bnei Yisrael were circumcised in the desert, right? You're traveling for 40 years, and Brit Milah is one of the foundational mitzvot. And so anyone who's born in the desert, why aren't they getting circumcised? Like, why suddenly do we find that Bnei Yisrael enter Eretz Yisrael and Yoshua has to circumcise the whole people? Why is God commanding Yoshua now to do it when it wasn't an issue in the desert? And more than that, aren't there other mitzvot that are dependent on Brit Milah? The most famous example is probably the Korban Pesach, right? That we're told when Hashem commands the Korban Pesach right before Bnei Yisrael leaving Egypt. Right? He says, "Kol ben nachar lo yechal bo," and he says, "Kol harei lo yechal bo," that you have to be circumcised in order to eat the Korban Pesach. So what did Bnei Yisrael do for 40 years? That all these people who were born in the desert, so did they not celebrate Pesach in the desert? Like, what's going on? It seems very strange at first glance. So we'll see that this troubles the Gemara as well. So Yevamot on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Bet it says as follows: Uvamidbar my time alo mahul. So why weren't the people circumcised in the desert? Iba idema mishum chulshad orcha. So if you want, you can say because of the perils of the journey. In other words, the harsh conditions of the desert don't allow for circumcision to be done in a non-life-threatening way. And if you want, you can say because the northern wind wasn't blowing. Titan, it says in the Braita, that for the entire 40-year period that Bnei Yisrael were wandering in the desert, the northern wind did not blow for them. My taima, why didn't the northern wind blow? Mishum de nizufin havu. We'll see what that means in a minute. So if you want, you can say because Bnei Yisrael nizufim, which means spurned or rejected. We'll see what that means again. But if you want, you can say that the northern wind wasn't able to penetrate the ananei kavod, the clouds of glory that were protecting Machanei Yisrael while they were traveling. So the northern wind would normally blow, but it wasn't able to get through the cloud, and so it didn't reach them, and so they weren't able to circumcise. And the Gemara continues and says, Tana Rabbanan, we have a Braita which teaches, Kol Tana 40 shana she'yisrael b'midbar lo haya yom shelo nashva bo ruach tzfonit b'chatzi halayla. That for the entire 40-year period, there was not a single day where the northern wind did not blow in the middle of the night. In other words, the northern wind blew every night at midnight, in the middle of the night. Shenemar, it says, V'yi b'chatzi halayla v'Hashem yikal kol b'chor. Right, that in the middle of the night God struck the firstborn. So this teaches you that the middle of the night is a time of favor. The northern wind is a favorly wind. And so that teaches you the northern wind must have blown at midnight every day while Bnei Yisrael were traveling. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start by just understanding on a simple level what the shakla v'tayr, what the flow of the Gemara is, right? So why were Bnei Yisrael not circumcised? So the first answer is the journey was arduous or was dangerous. Okay, so I understand. In other words, we have perhaps the larger question of why wasn't there protection against chulsha d'orcha? Right? If they have these ananei kavod and there's constant miracles of the man falling, and why didn't the miracles extend to allowing them to do Brit Milah without being afraid for their lives? But putting that aside for now, the fact that the journey was too difficult in order to circumcise without it being potentially dangerous exempts you from Brit Milah. So we understand that. But what is this solution of nasiv ruach tzfonit? Who cares? What does the north wind have to do with anything? So in order to understand that, let's look at a Gemara in Bava Batra and Daf Chav Hei Amud Aleph, which teaches as follows: Amar Rav Chanan bar Abba, Amar Rav, Arba ruchot minashvot b'chol yom. There's 4 winds that blow every day. Ruach tzfonit im kulam, and the northern wind blows with the other winds. She'il malek ken en ha'olam mitkayem afilu sha'achat. For if this were not the case, if the northern wind did not join and blow with the other 3 winds every day, then the world would cease to exist. It would not be able to exist for even one second. V'ruach dromit kashem mikulan. And the southern wind is the harshest, most violent of them all. V'ilmale ben netz shema'amida mecharevet et ha'olam. And the southern wind, if it weren't for this ben netz, who stands there and blocks the wind, the southern wind would destroy the world. Shnamar, it says in the Yov, Hamivintcha yovar netz yifrosh knafav l'teman. Right? Do you understand the hawk who spreads his wings to the south? All right, this is in God's speech to Yov. He's talking about all the wondrous creatures. So the interpretation here is something to the effect of, if it wasn't for this ben netz, which I think Rashi says means it's some angel, like the son of the hawk or something to that effect. If it wasn't for that angel blocking the southern wind would destroy the world. And if the northern wind didn't blow constantly with the other winds, then that would also destroy the world. So what that means is that the northern wind has some ameliorating effects. It's a wind that keeps the other winds in check. It makes sure that the world can exist. It's a good wind. So what does that mean? Rashi me'aruchot lefi hiraka umetuka utzlula kedamar be'yevamot umematkan. That this wind is the most pleasant wind of the 4 winds, the northern wind. It's raka, right? It's soft, it's sweet, and it tempers the other winds, right? It blows with the western and the eastern wind, and it makes sure that they don't get too out of hand. The northern wind has these potentially pleasant. It's a pleasant wind. So why is that relevant for the story of Brit Milah? So what would seem is that, right, if you have a wind this northern wind that comes and blows, it adds a breeze, it makes things pleasant, it has potentially healing capabilities. It's a wind that allows for that. And so if that wind blows, then people can heal. Because this northern wind provides that. But if this wind is missing, then the harsh winds are the only ones that blow. And so that ability is not available. And so people cannot get Brit Milah when the northern wind is not blowing. So even though the Gemara in Bava Batra said that every day all four winds blow, including the northern wind, at least from the first part of the Gemara here, it seems to say the northern wind did not blow in the desert. And according to one opinion, and so that's why Bnei Yisrael could not be circumcised. Let's look at some commentary of Tosfot for a minute. Tosfot says, "My time lo mahul." Right. So why didn't Bnei Yisrael get circumcised? So mashma de lo mahul klal. Right. The implication of the Gemara, and of course the simple reading of Sefer Yoshua Perek Hey, is that in the desert they didn't get circumcised at all. However, uva Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer mashma shemalu. But if we read Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the implication is they did get circumcised in the desert. And here's a really, I think, a very beautiful, almost humorous midrash. Right, when Bilam is trying to curse Bnei Israel, but he's blessing them, he's looking out at the whole camp, and he sees Bnei Israel, he says, Mimana afar Yaakov, who can count the dust of Israel? So what does that mean? That the dust here is a euphemism for the foreskins of Bnei Israel, that while they were being circumcised throughout their travels, they had littered the desert with their foreskins. So it's clear from that Bnei Israel were circumcising throughout the desert. And here the kind of the middle ground is that they did Brit Milah, but they didn't do Priya, right? So there's the Brit Milah, and then there's this aspect of Brit Milah called Priya. In the halacha is I think peeling back the membrane. It's something that is also required, but it's on top of the Brit Milah. It's another part of the Brit Milah process that you have to do for it to be Yotzei, the mitzvah. So they did the Brit Milah part, but they didn't do the Priya. Because that's the part that's actually quite painful and quite susceptible to potentially being a health risk, is the Priya, not the Brit Milah itself. I don't know the details of the Brit Milah and the medical implications or anything, but that's what Megillat Starim de Rabbeinu Nissim does to try to explain the Midrashim. On the one hand seem to imply they did circumcise, and on the other hand, our Gemara would seem to say they didn't, that perhaps they did Brit Milah, but they didn't do the Priya. Mishum de lo nasiv l'ruach Tzfונית. So now Tosfot says something really interesting. Right? Tosfot says there's a story recorded in Sefer Bamidbar of Pesach Sheni, that in the second year that Bnei Yisrael were in the desert, God explicitly says to Moshe, tell everyone to do the Korban Pesach. And so it says everyone does the Korban Pesach, and there were some people that were Tameh, they couldn't do the Korban Pesach, and they came to Moshe and complained, and so God said, okay, so you have Pesach Sheni, a month after regular Pesach, right? And that whole story is recorded in the second year after Bnei Yisrael left Egypt. And it's the only mitzvah that happens. In other words, you assume that a lot of mitzvot were given at Har Sinai in the first year. They leave Har Sinai, and then God says, make sure make sure that you do Pesach. Why is that command? Why are we told that was commanded again, that everybody fulfilled it? So Tosfot wants to argue from there something interesting. He says, the Sifrei wants to argue something interesting from that. The Sifrei Omer de Bignutan sheYisrael Siper Katuv. The reason why the story of Korban Pesach is specifically pointed out as the one mitzvah that God commanded them to fulfill, and that they fulfilled even after the first year, but already in the second year. It's for the gnut of Yisrael. It's for the shame of Bnei Yisrael. Shelo asu ela Pesach echad b'mem shana, because this was the only Pesach that they fulfilled. Now, the first Pesach was obviously Yetziat Mitzrayim Pesach, and the first Pesach that they could fulfill according to the laws was the only one that they fulfilled until they made it to Eretz Yisrael. For the other 39 years, they didn't do Pesach. Why? Shelo matzinu she'asu Pesach ela b'shana shniya. Because the fact that the Psukim tell us specifically they did Pesach in the second year is to teach us that they didn't do it the rest of the time. V'tema, but this is shocking. V'chi b'mezid hayu nimna'in would they have purposefully not fulfilled Korban Pesach in year 3, 4, 5, 20, 39? ואם משום מילת זכרים שהיו מעכבים וחשיב גנות, לפי שגרמו הם דבר זה, ועל כיוון דלא אפשר לא הייתה מעכבת, כדאמר לאל, עמו לא אמר רחמנא ואז יקרא וגומר. So essentially what this is saying is that because they weren't circumcised in the desert, and you can't offer the Korban Pesach unless you're circumcised, starting from the next year already, there were people that weren't circumcised as part of Bnei Israel, anyone who had been born in the desert. And so since there were uncircumcised people as part of, in the families of Bnei Israel, they couldn't fulfill the Korban Pesach. So they only did it the first year. Why is that a gnai for Bnei Israel? Because the reason why they weren't able to be circumcised is because they were nizufin havu, that they were rejected. So what does nizufin havu mean? So it says here, Amar Rabbeinu Yitzchak mima'aseh meraglin, that God, they had divine displeasure, right? That the reason why the northern wind didn't blow was because God was angry at them for what they had done. According to Rabbeinu Yitzchak and Tosfot, it's the sin of the spies. Not only were they punished for 40 years, but that anger also manifested itself in that the northern wind no longer blew and they couldn't circumcise themselves. And then Tosfot continues, and not as Rashi explains it, Rashi says, what does it mean Bnei Israel were rejected and there was divine displeasure? Because they had done Chet HaEgel. So Tosfot says that doesn't make sense. Because we know God in some sense forgave Bnei Israel for the sin of the Chet HaEgel, because they built the Mishkan, and he says Salachti Kidvarecha and all that. But by the Chet Meraglim, we never see God really forget. We see God punishing them, and we know that there is a lack of forgiveness in some sense, that God is still angry about it. So Tosfot argues that that's what Nizufin Avu. But whether it's Chet Meraglim and Chet HaEgel, the fact is Bnei Israel did something that caused the northern wind not to blow anymore. At least according to one of the opinions in our Gemara. And so that's why they couldn't be circumcised. And so even though they were anusim, in other words, they couldn't be circumcised, and that was okay in the sense that it was potentially life-threatening, so it's not as though they deliberately violated Brit Milah, but the reason why they couldn't fulfill Brit Milah was because there was no northern wind, because they had sinned. And so the Sifrei comes and tells you that's why the Korban Pesach is only taught one time. That's why we're taught specifically that the Pesach was observed in the second year, to teach us all of that. That this is the only time they observed the Pesach throughout the entire 40-year experience was in that first year. Okay, very, very interesting. So that's kind of our sugya. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Ruach Tzfonit. So we saw we saw that there was the Gemara in Bava Batra, which talked about that the four winds all blow every day, and that the northern wind blows together with the other winds, right? Because if it didn't, then the world would not be able to stand. And Rashi said that means that it's a pleasant wind. But if we see here, Tosfot says, Lo nashva bahem ruach tzfonit, which basically means that the northern wind did not blow. So perish bifnei atzma, right? It doesn't mean that it means that the northern wind did not blow for Bnei Israel in the desert on its own. But you can't interpret that to mean it didn't blow at all, because the Tosfot here is bothered by the contradiction between what our Gemara says and the Gemara in Bava Batra. Then in Bava Batra it says if the northern wind doesn't blow, the world would not be able to exist. And here we say for 40 years the northern wind didn't blow. So Tosfot says, yeah, it didn't blow by itself. Because sometimes it blows by itself, sometimes it blows with the other winds. So in the desert, it didn't blow on its own, only with the other winds. But it had to have still blown with the other winds, otherwise the world would be destroyed. But when it only blows with the other winds, then the aspect of it that allows you to do Brit Milah is non-existent, and so Bnei Israel could not circumcise. If we look closely at the Iyun Yaakov on our Gemara, he adds a little bit more to this, and he says as follows. כל אותן 40 שנה שהיו במדבר, לא היה יום שלא נשבה ברוח צפונית בחצי הלילה. פירוש לפי שארבע רוחות מנשבות בכל יום, כדאית בסוף פרק כל הגל ופרק לא יחפור, ורוחות לא מעצר, כדאית בתענית דרדה, אוקיי. לכן במדבר שכאמר לא היה מנשב ברוח צפונית ביום, מכל מקום היה מנשב על כל פנים בלילה, בשעת רצון. So his way to resolve the contradiction is a different one. He says, when it says that the wind didn't blow for 40 years, that meant during the day. So it's not as Tosfot tried to argue that it only blew with other winds, but rather it means that the wind normally has an allotted time where it blows, and it didn't blow during the day. Instead, it blew at night, because the nighttime is Shat Ratzon. How do we know that the nighttime is Shat Ratzon? So we saw that before, that we learn it from Makat Bechorot, that it's a time of it's a favorable time at midnight.
Ron.
Yep.
Ron, why is Tosfot's answer an answer? Meaning, the problem is that they couldn't do Brit Milah because the north wind didn't blow, right? Because and we learned why is that? Maybe because of the healing properties that the north wind blows, and the blowing of the north wind brings, right? If he's saying that it never blew by itself, it only ever blew with the other winds, then why should that mean that they couldn't do Brit Milah?
So yeah, it's a good question. I think the way to understand it is that the northern wind, if it blows by itself, it brings this healing property to the world and allows you to do Brit Milah and recover. If the northern wind blows with other winds, then the other winds temper that ability of the northern wind. So you still can't have the healing of the Brit Milah, but when the northern wind blows with the other winds, it still has the effect of preventing the other winds from destroying the world. So it's kind of somewhere in between, right? If there's no northern wind at all, the world is destroyed because the other winds are too strong. If it blows with the other winds, it has enough power to prevent the other winds from destroying the world, but not enough power to exert its own healing abilities. And if it blows on its own, then it can do the healing and allow for Brit Milah. That's how I understand Tosfot. He doesn't say that explicitly, but that kind of explains his resolution of the two sugyas.
Then in theory, does that mean if you happen to be doing a Brit Milah when the north wind isn't blowing by itself, then that Brit Milah is in danger?
It's funny you say that, because these three dots here actually touch on that. The Gemara there says a person should not do a Brit Milah when the southern wind is blowing, but then the Gemara says, but nobody follows that anymore. It says ideally a person should not do this when the northern wind's not blowing because it's dangerous, but nobody cares about that, and so I think it's a Shomer P'tayim Hashem. The rabbi kind of throws up his hands and says, "May God protect those who fulfill His mitzvot, even if they're doing it in a foolhardy way." So yeah, you're right. I think it says one more thing too. Actually, let me check quickly. See what the actual thing is. Yeah, I skipped it on purpose, but maybe I should have brought that. It's 76, right? Oh no, 71. Excuse me. Okay, here we go. Right, so why weren't they circumcised in the desert? Right, so it says, Rav Papa says, so no circumcision can be performed on a cloudy day or on a day when it's the south wind. Right, when the Ruach Dromit blows, you shouldn't get a Brit Milah, because on that day, the south wind nullifies the effects of the north wind, and then you won't be able to recover, which is the whole crux of what the Gemara in Yevamot is saying. But then Rav Papa concludes and says, but today, since many people are in the habit of disregarding such precautions, may Hashem preserve the simple. All right, like nobody listens to that anymore. People do Bris Milah, they don't care if it's the north wind, if it's the south wind. They have the caterers, they have the hall. That's what's going to determine if they do the Brit Milah, not which wind is blowing. So, it's a good question.
So I think if you want to be a mohel, you should probably study meteorology first.
Right. Right. I mean, it's not what are these winds exactly, right? Like it's a good question. But yeah, because the southern wind is a dangerous wind, so you shouldn't do it then unless you have the north wind to counter it. Okay, let's learn one more quick Gemara here. So this is a famous actually Gemara. So we said that the north wind blew at midnight in the desert, right? Because the north wind is a favorable wind and midnight's a favorable time. That theme actually comes up in another place in the Talmud. Damar of Acha bar Bizna, Amar of Shimon Chasida, Kinor hayat talui lemala mimitato shel David. That David HaMelech had a harp hanging above his bed. He would go to sleep, the harp was hanging over his head. Kevan shigeh chatzot laila, when exactly midnight came, ba ruach tzfonit v'noshevet bo u'menagen me'elav. The northern wind would start to blow, because the northern wind starts blowing at midnight. It would blow through the harp and start playing a melody, and wake him up. And that's when he wrote Tehillim. In other words, throughout his life, he would get woken up by this harp, and then for the last 6 hours of the night, he'd wake up and write Sefer Tehillim until the day started and he had to go do his kingly duties. So it's a nice Gemara. There's a lot kind of discussed there. But if we look at the Eitz Yosef on that particular Gemara, he says, Kinor hayat telui lemala mimitato. So he says, the Amar Mar, the Arba Ruchot menashvot b'chol yom. Eitz Yosef notes that Rashi on that Gemara comments on the four winds and says as follows: there are four winds that blow every day. Shesh shaot shel yom rishonot menashevet ruach mizrachit ba lo chachama. The eastern wind blows from sunrise to the middle of the day, which makes sense because the sun is rising, so it's the eastern wind. V'shesh shaot achronot ruach dromit uvitchilat alayla ruach ma'aravit. And in the second half of the day, the southern wind blows, which is the harsh winds. And then the first half of the night, the western wind blows. And then the second half of the night, which is from midnight until the day starting, the northern wind blows. So here we have a different model, according to Rashi, of the interaction between the four winds. It's not that they randomly blow throughout the day and that sometimes the northern winds blows on its own, sometimes with the others. It's that there's an allotted time for each wind. And there's 6 hours, 6 hours, 6 hours, 6 hours, and it all makes 24 hours. So this way of understanding, this Rashi's interpretation of the four winds here is going to be different than what Tosfot said, because Tosfot said earlier that, or really what the Gemara in Bava Batra said, that sometimes the northern wind blows with the other ones. It seems from Rashi's comment on Brachot that he understands the northern wind differently from the Gemara in Bava Batra, and that the northern wind just blows from midnight to the beginning of the day every day. But Rashi's interpretation of the northern wind having an allotted time can also make sense with our Gemara.
That becomes problematic for the Gemara. They didn't do bris milah because there was no northern wind. Because you don't do bris milah at night, right? So then you would never be if the northern wind only ever blew at night. Then you would never ever be able to do Brit Milah.
Right.
If you had to do the Brit Milah when there was the northern wind. So that doesn't work with our Gemara that says they didn't do Brit Milah because there was no northern wind.
Okay, good. So I have two possible answers. One is that I may have misspoke just now, and even Rashi's comments in the Eitz Yosef doesn't necessarily preclude the northern wind still blowing with the others, just that it has an allotted time just for itself. So maybe it still blew with the eastern wind and the southern wind. Maybe you could say that. And just from midnight is when only the northern wind blows. Although I think that's hard to say, given that the Gemara being discussed is that the harp suddenly started playing. And if the northern wind blew with the eastern wind, like in the middle of the day, so wouldn't the harp play then? Or what about the first half of the night when David was sleeping and the harp wasn't playing, which is the western wind? So the western wind, or maybe it was the direction the harp was facing. I hear. I think maybe the easier solution is to say that, and this is kind of a cop-out, but I think it also makes sense that this whole thing has a lot of ibait ema, ibait ema, ibait emas, right? If you want, you can say that the reason they didn't get circumcised was because it was a dangerous journey, and you don't have to deal with the northern wind at all. So you could just say that, okay, maybe Rashi's approach of that the winds blow at separate times, and then, Johnny, to your point, so then the northern wind would never have blown during the day, had to bring out. Okay, so that's according to the opinion that says that the northern wind has nothing to do with why Bnei Israel didn't get circumcised in the desert. But according to that opinion, he would understand like Tosfot that no, the northern wind blows during the day with the other winds, and he doesn't ascribe to Rashi's dividing the winds up into separate hours. So maybe you could answer like that. But it's a good question. It was well thought. Sorry?
You said well thought, so I said thanks.
I just want to finish with this last little thing, which has a nice little message. for today's times. Pikad Rabbi Eliezer Perek Gimel is talking about the creation of the world, and it also talks about the four winds being created. Arba ruchot ba'olam. Ruach pinat mizrach, ruach pinat marav, ruach pinat hadarom, ruach pinat tzafon. Okay, there's a wind in every corner. Ruach pinat mizrach. Okay, the eastern wind, misham ha'or yotzei la'olam. It brings light. Makes sense. It's east. Ruach pinat hadarom, misham talalei bracha v'gishmei bracha yotzin la'olam. The southern wind brings dew and rains of blessing to the world, which is different than what we saw, which the southern wind was the harsh wind, right? Ruach pinat marav, misham choshech yotzei la'olam. Okay, the western brings darkness, which makes sense. Ruach pinat tzafon, misham otzot hashelag v'otzot habarad v'kor v'chom gshamim yotzim la'olam. Here the northern wind is the harsh, violent wind that brings hail and snow and storms. So it's a different tradition. But what I think is really interesting is davar acher, another interpretation. Ruach pinat tzafon, bara v'lo gmaro. That when God was creating the world, He did not finish the northern wind. He finished the southern, the eastern, and the western wind. He didn't finish the northern wind. Amar, and God said, Kol mi sheyomar shehu Eloha, yavo v'igmor et hapina azot, she'enachti, v'yadu hakol shehu Eloha. So God left the northern wind unfinished and says to the world, anyone who claims to be a God, let him come and finish the northern wind, and so then everyone will know that he's a God. Very strange. What is this Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer saying? So perhaps, right here we have davar acher, which means that it's a different opinion than the one immediately before, which said the northern wind is the harsh wind. Perhaps the davar acher is saying the northern wind is the wind that we understood it to be, based on Yevamot and all the midrashim we saw. In other words, a wind that heals, right? A healing wind that allows you to recover from Brit Milah or from any other disease. And so what God is saying is, the northern wind, if it was completed, that would mean that everyone would never be susceptible to disease or to illness, because the northern wind provides a healing. And so God deliberately did not finish the northern wind. And He says anyone who claims to be a God should come and finish the northern wind. And then we'll know that He's a God. But as long as they can't finish the northern wind, then it's clear that I'm still God. So what's the nimshal here? So perhaps it means that it's a message of warning to humanity not to think that they are godlike. And the proof of that is in disease and illness. No matter how strong mankind becomes and how sophisticated we are and how much we advance, the northern wind is never going to be completely finished. There's always going to be some aspect of the ability to, as it says in Shirat HaAzinu, that God is the only one who can create life, create death, and ultimately there's always going to be some aspect of disease and illness that's outside of mankind's control. And that's the idea of bara v'lo gmaro, that God left that in the world as a sign that He still is the ultimate ruler. So obviously in today's day and age, that's a very kind of prevalent message. Again, not to say that medical advances is not something that mankind should be proud of or pursue, but to always keep it into perspective that doesn't mean that we're infallible. And just when we think that we are, so nature comes and kind of gives us a dose of reality, perhaps. That's it. Questions?